future people who are coming to the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues brown bag, which isn't so much a brown bag anymore, but it's still fun. On the first 100 days of the Biden administration, we have all worked so hard to get Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris elected. And now I don't think we're expecting miracles, but we're hoping to see hopeful signs. And then we need to know what we focus our attention on and suggest that it needs to be looked at and thought about by the administration. And I'm going to, you know what? I paused this. There it is. Now we're recording, just so you know. But anyway, I think it's important that we look at that first 100 days. I'm not necessarily sure that's the way it's always going to go, but there are some hopeful signs. And so we have three really great speakers today. And I'm going to ask Jeanette to introduce our first speaker, Shawali Patel, from the National Women's Law Center. And take it away, Jeanette.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. Our speakers are going to talk about the 100 days, but not just limited to what has been accomplished in the 100 days, but holding our new administration, exciting administration, accountable for the future. President Biden has a good speech tomorrow, and it's my pleasure to introduce Shawali Patel, who is the Director of Justice for Student Survivors and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. She's a great advocate. She will address the gains made on the recognition and elimination of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Following the Me Too movement, as well as the latest reports from the governor's office in New York, the threat of harassment or actual assault has raised the consciousness of many people and moved legislative action, but more is needed. Most recently, the National Women's Law Center published NWLC lead civil rights brief in support of students' rights to be free from harassment and unfair discipline. Shawali, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to join the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues for this meeting. This is my first meeting that I'm joining as well. So, as Jeanette said, I will be providing. I'll be focusing more on kind of gains and what we expect to see in the education space, but we'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the workplace space as it comes to. When it relates to sexual harassment and which includes sexual assault and education. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Title IX or the Title IX rule changes, but I'll just provide a very brief overview because I know most of you are. So, you know, one thing I think that is really positive for, you know, one thing we have to look forward to coming from President Biden is his support of student survivors of sexual violence. So during the Obama administration, he was a supporter of strong Title IX protections addressing sexual harassment in education. And during his campaign, he made some commitments to strengthening Title IX protections so that schools are addressing sexual harassment effectively and students are not pushed out of school experience it. So just a little bit of background. Title IX is a civil rights law that prohibits sex discrimination in education. It's a very important law that was passed in 1972, which is the same year that the National Women's Law Center, the organization that I work at, was founded. And part of Title IX's mandate to ensure that there's no sex discrimination in schools is that it requires schools to address sexual harassment because sexual harassment is so pervasive in K-12 schools as well as post-secondary education. And unfortunately, it often leads to students who experience it being pushed out of school. And we've seen that in the cases that we litigate at NWLC, where we represent student survivors who've been sexually assaulted and then punished because of the assault and suspended, and their education was impacted. So it's a very serious problem. And when I talk about sexual harassment, I'm also including sexual assault and other forms of sexual violence. That's because our civil rights laws, uses the term sexual harassment to include a broad range of sexual conduct that is considered to be sexual violence. So just wanted to clarify that because I know that can be confusing. So under the Trump administration, unfortunately, the Department of Education, which they create rules implementing Title IX, that schools, K-12 schools and post-secondary institutions have to comply with. Institutions that receive federal money have to comply with. And so during the Trump administration, they rolled back protections for student and employees, school employees, survivors of sexual harassment, including sexual assault, that have been around for decades. So the Trump administration the Department of Education under earlier administrations had guidance in effect since 1997 that informed schools and how they're supposed to respond to sexual harassment. And then that issued guidance in 2011, 2001, in 2011 and 2014. And then unfortunately, when Betsy DeVos came in, she rescinded key guidance from 2011 and 2014, which weakened protections against sexual harassment. And she announced then that they were going to go into rulemaking. And so last year in May, the Trump administration finalized changes to the Title IX rule, to the Department of Education's Title IX rule, that narrows the definition of sexual harassment so that now for a lot of conduct that is sexual harassment, but now isn't considered severe enough, or it's not pervasive enough, or not considered to be objectively offensive enough, or if it occurs outside of an educational program or activity, so things of sexual assault happening at private parties, schools are no longer allowed to respond to that harassment under their Title IX policies. It's quite significant and quite astonishing that the Trump administration created a ceiling for civil rights laws when typically what the federal government does is creates a floor so that entities that have to comply with those laws can go and should be going above and beyond. They've also not only narrowed the definition of sexual harassment and limited what harassment schools can respond to, but in the cases when schools can actually respond, so let's say the harassment meets this narrow definition and it occurred within an educational program activity, then it mandates unfair and traumatic grievance procedures specifically for institutions of higher education, so colleges and universities. It allows schools to use an unfair standard of evidence that's stacked against survivors. It requires colleges and universities to allow for direct live cross-examination by an advisor of choice. And it requires schools to provide an advisor if the party cannot get one themselves. So what this creates are inequities if one student is able to afford an attorney and another student isn't. And so let's say that other student has a parent or a friend or a professor who's representing them. So you have a lawyer who's cross-examining on behalf of one student and someone who's a non-attorney doing on behalf of another. And so that's obviously going to create unfairness in the process and goes against Title IX's mandate for equitable grievance procedures. It would also be, it could be very traumatic as well, as we know from a lot of survivors that we have talked to, that to be directly questioned by their rapist advisor of choice, it could be their friend, it could be their parent, it could be really traumatic and triggering. And so it's a huge concern. It's a big change. And there are also a number of other changes that are made in the Title IX rule, and I can share a resource to provide more information on that. So as a result of these changes, there have been a number of lawsuits that have been filed last year to stop this Title IX rule from going into effect. There have been 5 so far. And the National Women's Law Center has also sued the Department of Education to stop the Title IX rule. Right now, none of the cases have yet been successful. The rule is still in effect. There are several that are pending, including ours. We had a trial in November and we're waiting for the outcome. But depending on how the judge rules in our case, which could be any day now, that could impact what President Biden can do on the Title IX rule. Because it is a rule, while Biden has committed to undoing the harms that were been caused by the Trump administration, they can't just do it automatically. They have to go through the rulemaking process, which could take 1.5 to 2 years. It's going to take a really long time. Meanwhile, students are being impacted under the rule while it's in effect. So we, along with some of your organizations, have requested the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris transition team at the time, last December, to take a number of actions around the Title IX rule. One thing we asked them to do is to immediately begin the rulemaking process, given how long it takes. And that requires conducting meetings with stakeholders, with students, survivors, educators, other experts and advocates to understand how the rule has impacted them and what changes they need to see. We also have asked that they think about how the litigation, the pending litigation challenging the rule could impact what they can do in the interim pending rulemaking. So for example, to consider if they could decide as an administration not to enforce certain provisions of the rule because of the challenges that the questions about the legality of those provisions that were raised in the lawsuits, or the issues with implementing this during COVID, right? So this rule went into effect during a global pandemic while schools were scrambling to revamp the way that they operated to meet the needs of students. This new rule now also requires them to put in an incredible amount of resources to now create mini trials, right? Like procedures, for example, for higher ed institutions. And it creates confusion because if the rule doesn't allow schools to respond to sexual harassment that occurs outside of an education program activity under their Title IX rule, well, what does this mean for a student who's now being sexually harassed while learning remotely from their home? You know, where is that line between educational program activity? So there's just questions that are raised about the application of the rule. And so we've asked the Biden administration to, think about how they cannot enforce certain provisions, and to the extent that they are deciding to enforce this bad Trump rule, pending rulemaking until they actually can change it after the rulemaking process. We've asked that they've issued some interim technical assistance guidance that can provide for as broad of an interpretation of the rule as possible. So for example, the rule, as I said earlier, doesn't allow schools to respond to sexual harassment unless it's considered severe enough under their Title IX policies, but schools can still choose to have their non-Title IX policies to address that type of sexual harassment. So that is something the Biden administration can urge schools to do. Another example is the supportive measures. So interim measures, accommodations like changing housing, allowing extensions on exams, providing counseling, providing no contact orders, making sure that student survivors are no longer in the same class as their rapists pending an investigation. These are supportive measures that schools can take to protect a survivor's access to education. The changes that Trump made to the Title IX rule only require these type of supportive measures and others if the sexual harassment meets this narrow definition under Title IX, meets the Title IX definition, I should say. So another thing the Biden can do is clarify that schools can and should still provide supportive measures to harassment that doesn't meet this narrow Title IX standard because it still has an impact. And a whole bunch of other things that they could do to broaden the interpretation of the rule. So in March, early March, President Biden issued an executive order basically announcing some actions that he's directing federal agencies, including the Department of Education, to take around the Title IX rule. And it's broadly worded to apply not only to discrimination based on sex or sexual harassment, but also sex discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity discrimination, and had asked the department to evaluate the Title IX rule. And so in April, earlier this month, the Department of Education the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, which is charged with changing the Title IX rule, essentially, issued a letter. And in the letter, they announced several actions that they're going to take, which is great, kind of, heeding our call in some ways that we made to the Biden-Harris transition team in December. First, they said that they are going to hold hearings on the sex discrimination in education to hear directly from students and other stakeholders, anyone in the public really, about experiences of sexual harassment, including sexual assault in schools, as well as experiences with discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We expect that the hearing should last a few days, hopefully. I don't know how long, and I don't know how many individuals they'll be able to hear testimony from, but they indicated that they will accept oral as well as written testimony. And we don't know when this will take place, but we were being informed that we will be given at least 4 weeks notice. And so once that notice is provided, groups like ours will be providing more information to organizations like yours and others on how to engage in that process, which is absolutely critical for providing information to the department about what the Title IX rules should look like as well. And so the department also announced that they're going to issue some sort of interim technical assistance guidance. Again, this is something that we had requested that hopefully provides for as broad an interpretation of the rule to the extent that it will apply. We don't know what the administration is going to include in that guidance document, but we know they announced that or technical assistance document, I should say, but they did announce they're going to release something. And then lastly, they said they anticipate going into rulemaking to change the Title IX rule. So that's a good sign that they're going to probably take steps to change it. I imagine that's what these hearings are for. And so we will, we're staying tuned for next steps and announcements from the department. So that's the update on that. And that's a huge win. And that is something that Biden had committed to during the campaign. It's, it is a priority because, like I said, this rule is incredibly harmful. And so the faster they can take action, the better. We've also are in the process as an organization, as well as others, CWI is joining this effort, to request Congress to take a number of actions to support student survivors of sexual harassment. Because while Title IX exists and it's an important law that protects against sex discrimination in education, unfortunately, there has been some weakening of Title IX protections in the courts over the last couple of decades that make it harder for survivors to prove their cases and get justice in their cases. So we're asking for an amendment to kind of to restore Title IX protections. We're also asking for Congress to cement protections, supportive measures that are needed for survivors to help them stay in school. So these are like the accommodations that I've talked about that are so important for, ensuring that survivors can continue to learn and have access to education as Title IX requires. We're also asking Congress to take steps to address retaliation against survivors. So something that we've noticed and have seen, and as I mentioned earlier, have focused on in the cases that we litigate, is when schools punish survivors who come forward with allegations, with complaints of sexual assault, and oftentimes relying on rape myths, right? Blaming them for students for defending themselves, or blaming them for what they were wearing or other conduct that occurred. Maybe they were intoxicated at the time. things that are just really terrible that chill reporting and make it harder for survivors to come forward. So, and is particularly bad for survivors of color. So we know, for example, Black girls in particular are discriminatorily, disproportionately disciplined. And we see that in how they're treated when they report sexual harassment, assault, or LGBTQ students or students with disabilities. And so asking for there to be strong protections against retaliation and against punishing survivors who come forward. And we've also asked for resources to be put into supporting comprehensive sex education, which is one of, which is the most the proven method, I guess, for preventing gender-based violence, including sexual harassment and dating violence in schools. And so comprehensive sex education that is LGBTQ inclusive, medically accurate, age appropriate is critical, so that, you know, there's actual prevention on these issues. And then we address other issues like teacher trainings and providing more funding to the Department of Education as to amplify their enforcement of the civil rights laws they work on through providing technical assistance or putting more resources into issuing policy guidance, into rulemaking because it's such a long process, and into their enforcement efforts so that they could engage in more investigations. As well as more support for Title IX coordinators. And I know this is something Sue has been a very strong supporter of through like legislation like GEA, the Gender Equity in Education Act, and other legislation. Title IX coordinators are critical for ensuring that schools are taking sexual harassment and other forms of sex discrimination seriously. So we're excited about releasing this document of our priorities. We have over 70 organizations that have joined, and they're not just women's rights organizations or survivor advocacy organizations, but there are a range of civil rights organizations that are joining this call, which we will release later this week. And we're asking for Congress to take action before the 50th anniversary of Title IX, which is next June 2022. And lastly, I just wanted to briefly mention some updates around the workplace issues. So this will be brief because there haven't been a ton of wins with regards to workplace harassment, but we know that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal agency, is prioritizing finalizing the long-delayed workplace sexual harassment guidance, which the Trump administration blocked. And we also hope to see movement and engagement on the Be Heard Act. This is a comprehensive bill that addresses workplace harassment, including sexual harassment, given the Biden, given his promise during the campaign. So this is what we hope to see in the coming months, and I'm sure as we get updates, we'll let you all know. So happy to answer any questions.
I think we'll have the questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. I know you coordinated the presentation. The National Women's Law Center coordinated the presentation at the OMB, and that was very helpful. I hope National Women's Law Center will do the same for the hearing.
Yeah, so that will happen during the rulemaking process. So the hearings are occurring before the Title IX rule is actually proposed, because once an agency proposes changes to a rule through an NPRM, so notice of proposed rulemaking, they can't meet with outside stakeholders in the same way that they can before there's a rule, but there will be a way to engage with the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. They're like tasked with ensuring that agencies are doing a proper cost benefit analysis when they're, promising changes to rules, that they're considering the impact on individuals and other stakeholders, and that they're following the law. So we will provide information once we get to that process on how groups can request those meetings.
Thank you, Shawali. And I'll remind people that the chat is available for posing questions for the future. I'm going to turn it over to you, Connie.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next speaker is Ariane Hegewisch. I hope I've said your name right. I stumble over it every once in a while. She comes to us from the Institute of Women's Policy Research, where she's the program director of Employment and Earnings. And she's also a scholar in residence at American University. And prior to that, she was at IWPR as a scholar in residence. She came to IWPR from the Center for Work-Life Law at UC Hastings. She's responsible for IWPR's research on workplace discrimination and is a specialist in comparative human resources with a focus on policy and legislative approaches to facilitate greater work-life reconciliation and gender equality in the U.S. and internationally. She comes with a broad range of experience and has published many, many papers and co-edited several books on women, work, and inequality, the challenge of equal pay in a deregulated labor market. She's going to talk to us today about the economic progress in the first 100 days. IWPR has done the research to expose the economic impact of COVID on women and families, especially women of color, and the steps needed to help women overcome the struggles of fair pay, job preparation, and glass ceilings. Ariane, I turn it over to you, and you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you so much. So, it's my,
Wow.
there we are.
Okay.
So thank you so much for this opportunity and for making me think about more systematically about the world we've been in for the last 100 or 99 days. So what, as Connie said, what I thought I'd do is to kind of think of where we were, kind of where we find ourselves in terms of economic security now, and how the current administration has approached it, and then one of few things where I feel more can be done. But overall, I think we all have to acknowledge, especially on work issues, it has been a total whirl, and lots of activities. Just to all of you will know this, but to remind ourselves where we were at the start of the pandemic, where we are now in a lot of ways. There is a child care and care crisis, and of course we entered the pandemic with a lot of families being caught either with not being able to find childcare or not being able to afford what there was in the market. Because of the pandemic, we have had record levels of unemployment and workforce exits. We entered the recession with a profound wealth gap and large earnings inequalities, which means that particularly Black women and Latinas entered the recession with many fewer resources than some other groups. So anything that was unequal before has gotten more unequal now. We had no, a very patchy work-family supports, particularly around the type of supports that you need to face a health crisis. No universal paid family leave, no paid sick leave, no universal healthcare access, and of course, with unemployment, a lot of people additionally lost healthcare. And we have had and have profound occupational segregation, with over 40% of women and men working in occupations that are either predominantly male or predominantly female, whatever it is for their gender, and this making a big impact on wage inequality. So just to kind of share a few results on where we are at now, IWPR conducted a survey in February, a nationally representative survey of working women, partly to collect the type of issues that should be on the Biden agenda. And as you can see here, something like close to half of all women saying that they're really worried about paying family expenses, but this share of women being particularly high for Hispanic women and Black women, right? So this issue of facing economic security, but not everybody facing economic security. So, you know, kind of very mixed fortunes. Second issue, of course, mothers have been particularly hard hit by this pandemic as workers, partly because they were concentrated in sectors which were particularly hard hit, but also because schools and childcare centers closed and the childcare burden disproportionately landed on their shoulders. But again, you can see that there are substantial differences by race and ethnicity. And what this shows is that about, you know, again, about close to half of all women say they either cut back or some of them both stopped working or cut back their hours because of childcare issues. And of course, that also directly translates into lower income in the household. So where are we in terms of getting back to normal? And what this does, this chart, which we started during the Great Recession, it charts men and women on payroll. That is anybody with a W-2 form, and you probably know, you know, this tends to slightly overcount women because if you have two jobs, then you may be counted twice, right? So, but I think the first issue to kind of take to look at is that, you know, when we entered the Great Recession 12 years ago or 13 years ago, 14 years ago, my God, counting, you know, it was men were really outnumbering women on payroll, right? And since then and during that recession, employment collapsed for men first and then women followed. But in the last 10 years of the recovery, the gap between men and women narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. And when we got to February last year, women were actually more likely to, they outnumbered men on payroll. And that's the first time, I think, for almost forever. Then everything collapsed, and you can see women that this, you know, women's jobs collapsed more than men. And still, I don't know whether you can see that. I just see the photos. Whoops. But, you know, women have caught up less than men. So women are lagging. They lost more jobs and they're further behind where they were in February last year. And of course, the economy would have grown since then. So we need to capture more jobs than we had. Now, this is why the reasoning behind this is broken down by major sectors of industries, how far we are still behind the job levels of February pre-pandemic job levels. And, you know, leisure and hospitality is the top sector. You can see women's jobs still 1.7 million jobs below where we were in February 2020. And many of these jobs were not very good jobs, part-time jobs, but they were jobs. Men also behind, but less so. But broadly, this reflects the division, you know, how many jobs proportionately women held before the pandemic. Health and education service, another one, almost 1 million jobs out from where we were. And of course, health gained a lot of jobs, but then, you know, there are lots of sectors in the healthcare service which couldn't be done anymore. And that also includes childcare, which is really lagging behind still. And again, this is a sector, this is proportionately more or less to where we were pre-recession. So what this shows is the big segregation we have in the labor market. Also concentrated particularly in the lower wage jobs here are Black and Hispanic women, which is why their unemployment is so much higher. So thinking about who has lost jobs, how does this distribute between sectors? What this does is in terms of individuals who lost their jobs, right? The first one was jobs on payrolls. This is the current population survey in terms of individuals. And you can see overall, I mean, women are slightly outnumbered by in terms of the jobs, absolute people who lost jobs. So I think that's maybe a little surprising, but it's a difference between jobs on payroll and individual employees. But on the whole, you can see among white women and men, and this is not exclusive, so it includes in Hispanics. You know, the job losses for white women have been slightly less than for white men, but for Hispanic women, for Black women, this has been the reverse, and for Hispanic women, this has been reverse. And altogether, almost 1 in 10 fewer Black women are employed now than they were in February last year. So a huge impact on economic security. So just to look at unemployment, you know, just the rates, they're in the most recent figures in, so for March, midweek March, 4.4 million women were officially unemployed, had looked for work within the last 4 weeks. 43% have been unemployed for more than 6 months. And that's fairly similar for different groups, that proportion. But Black women's rate of unemployment is still 1.7 times higher than white women's, and Latinas 1.5% higher. And as I said, white women here includes Hispanic women, so the differences likely would be larger if we could do this with the microdata and separate people out. So unemployment, formal unemployment is a big issue. And added to that are 1.8 million women who have disappeared from the civilian labor force, who are no longer actively looking for work or haven't been for now. And again, a much bigger decline, 5% decline for Black women compared to 2.4% decline for white women. And some of these differences are that the type of jobs white women hold mean that they are much more likely to be able to work from home. So, you know, even though the pressure of working from home and having to do childcare has been enormous on a lot of people, it's really hell, kind of, when you listen to what happens to people. They did have the opportunity to work from home, whereas for a lot of Black and Latina women, or for a lot of women, that isn't possible. I mean, I don't know whether you're aware, because we talk a lot about teleworking and home working. At the moment, just 25% of women who work do telework. That means 75% work outside of the home. And really, that has been the same for about almost 6 months or so. So most women during the pandemic had to work out of the home. But what this means is 4.4 million women officially unemployed, 1.8 million women who left the workforce, is that there is a huge challenge in terms of bringing these back to work, to jobs. And we know, you know, from past experience, if you're out of work for more than 6 months for whatever reason, to catch up with your peers in terms of earnings is virtually impossible. Often people may come back to a lower paid job, they have lost seniority. And of course, we also don't know how quickly those leisure jobs are going to come back in the first place. So big challenge in terms of workforce development. Last issue I just wanted to share is, again, you know, the pandemic really exposed the issue of not having paid family leave, and the patch that was put in that companies between 50 and 500 employees could get, had to provide paid leave and could get it reimbursed, left a lot of people out. and it did not work. You know, you get a lot of stories from people working for larger companies who did not get paid family leave. But again, you can see the big difference in access, how much Latinas are likely to work in the worst sector where job quality is the lowest. Okay, so I started with saying what were the challenges, where are we now, what is on the agenda from the Biden administration. And of course, I think there's been, you know, I was going through all the executive orders that were submitted and where either something was rescinded or, you know, there've been over 40 have been passed already, and quite a bit of it is around discrimination, access to benefits, and so on. So a lot has happened, and of course also in the American Rescue Plan and what we're expecting in the American Families Plan tomorrow. But to, you know, as a start, I think what is really positive is the full recognition of childcare and care as infrastructure. And I think, you know, that was somewhat there during the last recession, during ARA, but they were much less explicit around it. And it's something, I think what I find interesting, you know, watching PBS NewsHour each night, and because for me, yes, it's obvious, care as infrastructure, right? But when we were trying to use the term childcare as infrastructure, before, some people say, you shouldn't use childcare infrastructure because in people's heads, it's like, you know, the facilities and the buildings, but this is being used internationally as a way to push for more investment in care, in the care infrastructure for a while. But as I said, PBS, they still, every time they talk about the infrastructure package, they're kind of slightly snidey when they mention yes, and they also include, of course, in this the definition, you know, care and childcare and the broadband, as if that isn't infrastructure. So I thought everybody would fall over and say, of course, but they haven't clearly. So it continues to be a challenge in terms of what we asked for in the recovery report that Connie sent out with a newsletter. Basically, I think what is going to be in the Families Act together, what's already been expended, will vastly exceed what we said. We thought, okay, it needs 100 billion, you know, double what it brings it. And I think what's in there is about, you know, 200 billion for childcare, 240 billion. That's the estimates for pre-K expansion and some other stuff. So that is on the cut. And of course, the child benefit, even though it's still temporary, that was included in the rescue and in the American Rescue Plan or Act, was really a big boost to family economic security. So on unemployment, I think what is interesting is that unemployment insurance, of course, was extended, and that the higher level that is actually has given people some break. You know, jobs were so bad, so that it may actually exert pressure on improving jobs coming back. In terms of workforce supports, or I said the need for workforce development and supports is going to be enormous. But what has been recognized is that workforce supports without childcare is going to leave out a lot of women, a lot of people. So all the, you know, we need to see how this works out. And WIOA, can never say this, is up for reauthorization. So there will be a lot of work there. But at least the concepts are recognized. The recession or the pandemic has shown how desperately out of shape the unemployment systems were, and I think there's still pressure and desire to reform the unemployment insurance system and to include automatic warning, automatic kicking in of higher benefits during certain bits. So that's on the agenda. And then apprenticeship. This is one, and I'll talk more about this on occupational segregation. This is an area where we do a lot of work, and the administration has already taken away some of the apprenticeship system that were designed to reduce oversight and regulation. But we would like to see a greater focus on including the updates of 2930, you know, a more proactive monitoring and enforcement in those fields. Some of this is started, some of this is still with Congress. So, you know, the Biden administration, I guess, can't wave a magic wand and say, pass this, give it to us. So, and then the other issue on unemployment, of course, is that the focus of the infrastructure bill and the others bill have been on trying to create good jobs rather than coming back to where we are before. We know the minimum wage is difficult. It hasn't gotten through yet. Today, they announced the minimum wage for federal contractors, which is a good first step. But, you know, the other issues, union recognition, again, at the moment, it's limited unless the PRO Act is passed. You know, there's been support, very verbal, but the infrastructure hasn't really changed that much yet in terms of what they can do. And there are lots of positive things going on, I think, in federal enforcement in terms of who has been appointed at the OFCCP, what they're doing to try and help the EOC do more. And I think a lot will happen there, but they need to also ramp up because they're totally understaffed at the moment. And I don't know how far the new Gender Council will play a role in putting some more pressure on that. So that's, I think, something to observe. And we have been through Tradeswomen's Task Force and so on, have been part of discussions with the OFCCP and the Office of Apprenticeship to talk about those processes. Paid family leave, I'm sure that, you know, something will be in the bill in the act tomorrow and in the speech tomorrow. So we're expecting this. Who knows whether we'll get there? But then the last issue which I wanted to raise for discussion is where I feel more could be done. It could be more explicit. We know that occupational segregation has been really behind a lot of the inequality that we've experienced both during the pandemic and before. It accounts for about half of the wage gap. It's really behind the wage gap not closing. It kind of resulted in Black and Hispanic women working in these low wage service industries. So the way I see what the Biden administration is doing very well or focusing on very well is thinking about the jobs that women do now in care can be improved. How can we make those jobs better? There is less emphasis on how do we make the jobs that will be created through the conventional infrastructure investment or through green jobs infrastructure investment. How can we ensure that those jobs, a higher proportion of those jobs go to women than do now? And it seems to me kind of like almost, okay, we improve women's jobs here and men's jobs there. And you know, the wage gap, again, incomes gap is in those jobs, a lot of those jobs that are being created that don't need university level education, but need training, on the job training, certificates, career and technical education. Women have to they have to, you know, it's like almost like the frog doing milk, you know, they have to really work, get one certificate after the next and never reach men's earnings. So construction jobs, transportation jobs, jobs in as mechanics in manufacturing, all those, women are 5% or fewer. And I think there has been a momentum since the Obama administration focused more on diversity in apprenticeships. But it's really, to me, it's scandalous that, it's 2021 and, women are 3% of electricians. So I feel there could be more emphasis there. But that's it. And I guess now I have to stop sharing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I just feel like my head, I can't wait for the speech tomorrow night. I'm going to be sitting on the edge of the sofa waiting to hear what he's going to do. Okay, our next speaker is Mindy Grimes-Festge. Mindy is, let me get to my thing here. Mindy comes from a family tradition of teachers. She's currently the Secretary Treasurer of the United Teachers of Dade, but she comes by it genetically because her mom was a teacher and belonged to the United Teachers of Dade, and in fact walked the picket line in 1985. So Mindy's well aware of what union members have accomplished by standing together. She's a graduate of North Miami Senior High. She got her bachelor's degree in elementary education from Florida International University, and she taught for 25 years at Dr. Frederica Wilson Skyway Elementary School, where she was a staunch advocate for the teaching profession. She served as gradebook manager, and I'm not sure what that is, but I guess that's because I haven't had kids in the school system for a long time. And most importantly to me, she was the union building steward for more than 12 years. She understands education inside out, not only as a teacher, but as a mom to 3 boys and a school staffer facing the perils of the pandemic, as well as other pressures brought to bear on educators in today's current educational landscape. She's going to talk to us about the educational needs of students, especially the impact of forced virtual learning in the face of the pandemic, and also the hot topic issue today of when is it safe to reopen our schools. So Mindy, I'm turning it over to you, and I will get to your PowerPoints.
Thank you so much, Connie. It's great to be here with so many amazing women. I just want to make one correction. My mom walked the picket line in 1968.
Oh,
not
68.
1985. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I come from a family of educators, so for me, it's a passion. So just to get to everything that's going on, fortunately, the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration has shown a marked improvement in the care and attention paid to education policy and support in comparison to the previous 4 years. You can go to the next slide, Connie.
Yep. Okay, wait a minute. Let me figure out how to do that. There we go.
There you go. So the American Rescue Plan Act, as everybody knows, passed in March, and it provided a significant infusion of funding to K-12 schools.
I'm going to get off.
Okay.
The K-12 schools, the bulk, 90% going to Title I schools, so it's targeted to our low-income communities. Overall, the plan provided a much-touted $1.9 trillion, that's trillion with a T, stimulus to address the impact of COVID-19. Of that, $170.3 billion go back one. Back one. Yeah, thanks, Connie, right there. Making this the federal government's largest ever one-time investment in schools at $125.5 billion for K-12 schools. And as an example of what that means at the state level here in Florida, that provides an additional $6.15 billion in K-12 funding. And that's a significant bolster when our state economy is otherwise experiencing an outsized downturn, because we are tourism and hospitality industries here, and they were effectively shut down over the last year. And they're just really starting to get back to reopening now with caution, we hope. You could go to the next slide, Connie. So considering women's outsized role in childcare, it's significant that portions of the funding go directly to after-school programs and summer enrichment programs. Both will receive $1.2 billion nationally, and for us here in Florida, that amounts to an additional $70 million in funds for each. And that will help Title I districts provide additional care for the children of working families, enabling some of those mothers and caretakers to re-enter the workforce or work additional hours if they otherwise lacked safe childcare options. The next slide, employment levels for teachers have still not recovered to pre-recession 2008 figures, And that has a dramatic impact on the performance in our schools for starters. In other words, if the federal government had not stepped in to help our public schools, more than 395,000 education jobs would have been lost. So we see on this chart that employment levels for teachers have still not recovered to pre-recession figures, and for starters, that has a dramatic impact on the performance in our schools. Further, research has shown that teacher cuts during the last recession disproportionately impacted districts and schools serving students of color and students from low-income families. This also had the result of creating higher rates of teacher turnover in schools with the highest concentrations of students in poverty, further undermining their learning. So the children and families who most needed support from teachers would be those most likely to be negatively impacted. And since women make up 80% of the teaching workforce, mass teacher layoffs or lack of opportunity to enter the profession disproportionately impact women. Projecting out a 15% reduction in state education funding due to the budget impact of the COVID-19 pandemic could lead to the loss of more than 300,000 teaching positions across the country, according to an analysis from the Learning Policy Institute. That's an 8.4% reduction across the country. And that same analysis finds that impact could vary among states based on how they fund their local districts. So while, for example, Hawaii could lose up to 20% of their teachers, Florida might lose 4.1%. I can't speak to the devastation that would cause in Hawaii, but I can't imagine how devastating it would be here in Florida if we were forced to cut 4.1% of our teachers. And for us in Miami-Dade, that would be more than 800 teachers. And I know the result would be more overcrowding. So in the old days, like 18 months ago before pandemic, overcrowding was already an issue where we could measure the learning loss. The more kids in the classroom, the less the adults in the room have time and attention to address the students' individual needs. Now, in addition to the academic challenge of overcrowding, it becomes a health and safety situation. So as many districts return to face-to-face instruction, this means more students and the potential to spread more infection while infections exist. By and large, children are not even being vaccinated yet, so we really don't know what more widespread opening of schools will bring. We see similar situations in healthcare and nursing, another female predominant profession where there were critical staffing shortages. And simply put, when there were not enough nurses available to deal with the increased needs of COVID-19, what happened? More patients died, more nurses were exposed to more patients, and they also got sick and died. So these were tragic stories, and we all heard about them. We generally did not see the same widespread infections in teachers, fortunately, because most of the schools shifted immediately to remote learning. And those families and teachers were kept in bubbles. So after returning to face-to-face instruction, and keep in mind, here in Miami-Dade, we were the largest school district in the country that pretty much went back near the beginning of the academic year. We saw some instances where teachers got sick and died from being infected. And we have to question how much of that could have been prevented with different national leadership at that time. Just for clarification, Miami-Dade is the 4th largest school district in the country. And New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago all stayed remote for significant portions of the year while our district was open for face-to-face instruction, although approximately half of the parents kept their children home for remote learning. But there's an intersection between healthcare and education. A quarter of schools have neither a full-time nor a part-time school nurse, and most schools lack the counseling support that they will need to help students navigate the mental health challenges of returning to school. Adding needed nurses and counselors will cost several $billions per year. And the Center on Budget Policy and Priorities calls for this money to be allocated. Next slide. So the president pledged to vaccinate 100 million Americans within the first 100 days. And he not only met that goal, but he exceeded it with more than 140 million fully vaccinated as of yesterday. He also called, more than 1/3 of US adults are now fully vaccinated, and more than half of them have received at least one dose. He also called for all schools to be open for face-to-face instruction. We kind of bit our nails when he made that announcement. Since children are not being vaccinated in mass numbers yet, we will have to see how that works out. We just want to make sure that we are protecting our students and teachers and their families as much as possible, especially with the new variants impacting those under 25 years of age. Here in South Florida, we have the highest number in the nation of those under 25 testing positive for these variants. In earlier surges, children, especially younger children, played only minor roles in transmitting the infection. When they were diagnosed with COVID-19, their symptoms tended to be mild or even absent. And for reasons that aren't well understood, they haven't usually been the first cases in households or clusters. Now, as more coronavirus variants have begun to dominate and seniors gain protection from vaccines, that pattern may be changing. Infectious disease experts are watching to see if COVID-19 will start to spread in a pattern more similar to influenza, with children becoming infected first and bringing the infection home to their parents. There was actually an article that I read talking about how the number of children that have died from influenza this year is so much lower than typical years. And we have to say that's because the children are now wearing face masks a lot of the time, so they're not spreading that illness from one to the other. So according to the CDC, Florida has racked up more than 3,000 cases of the coronavirus variant B.1.1.7, which originated in the UK and is more contagious than the original strain. Next slide, please. So when schools moved to remote learning, we know that many working moms were directly impacted since they typically are the ones who monitor the education of their children. Many of our teachers, even though they were able to teach remotely, were very stressed out and are stressed out because they're not only teaching the students in their classes, they're also making sure that their own children are doing what they need to do. According to AmericanProgress.org, women were already struggling to manage work and care before the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic-induced recession, economic precarity was already a reality for many women and their families. In 2018, 21.4 million women lived in poverty, nearly 11 million children. 14.4% of all children under age 18 lived in poverty in 2019. Women's participation in the labor force had not yet returned to its 2000 peak by the time the coronavirus pandemic began, and workers faced slow wage growth, which failed to keep up with the growth in productivity. So more than 2.3 million women left the workforce between February of 2020 and February of 2021, according to the National Women's Law Center. That drove the participation rate of women working down to 57%, a level last seen in 1988. So overall, women have lost a net of 5.4 million jobs during the recession, nearly 1 million more job losses than men. The job losses in December are a stark illustration of these trends. This push of job losses has created a recession in which more women have been affected, leading some like Sina Cole-Mason, she is the executive director and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, to label the downturn a she-cession. And in our district, those who needed to work at school, even though they're not teachers and they couldn't teach remotely, if they were security monitors or clericals, we made sure that they had the ability to bring their own children to work with them so that they wouldn't have to lose money. That was very important for us and for our members and for our community. And so, we understand the need to reopen schools to get our economy up and running. And we want to get women back in the labor force, but we need to be cautious of how this should happen. Next slide, please. So these are straightforward, clear-cut measures that have been articulated through the country. State federations and locals like ours have been able to craft agreements based on these principles, the AFT reopening plan principles. For us, these principles help form the basis for our letters of understanding with the district that we reached when we shifted to distance learning initially in March of 2020, and again, when we returned to provide instruction both face-to-face and via distance learning at the beginning of this academic year. And we know that there are other locals across the country that use these same plan principles to make sure that they had letters of understanding with their districts so that people were kept safe, children and teachers alike. So implementation and adherence to these principles has been an ongoing matter of education, advocacy, adherence, reiterating their validity, and making noise when they were violated. After more than a year, COVID-19 fatigue has certainly set in. Many of the adults in the community and in the schoolhouse have been vaccinated. Our students see young adults coming to our community to party for spring break, and it's tough to convince them that they need to still wear their masks at all times, including in social situations with their peers, sitting in classrooms or walking down the hallway at school. So they see these young people out partying at the beach and they want to be just like them. News reports indicate that researchers are concerned about transmissions they track to social events among teenagers and young adults where vaccination percentages are lower. Remember, we all had that youthful sense of immortality that we all felt. So it's happening now again. From a public health standpoint, we're working to educate our students to keep them safe with facts and also find a balance so that the trauma is not magnified. From an educational standpoint, it's troubling to think of the setback for students, many of whom were already in the most vulnerable conditions and faced all the challenges of poverty prior to COVID-19, which aggravated existing economic and social stratification. Our district did what we could by sending home tens of thousands of laptops and tech pads with students while arranging for free Wi-Fi to make sure the most vulnerable had the tools to participate in distance learning. We took thousands of other district-wide, school site, or in-classroom accommodations to make distance learning work. So we have stories about teachers physically making copies and driving them and distributing them to houses to give to their students, and teachers and paraprofessionals reaching out to families to check in and look for students who were either not showing up for school or who were not engaged in remote learning. They may have been on the Zoom, but not with a camera on, and they were not completing assignments. Next slide, please. So the next one is student well-being. So this has been the most important and I think the most challenging year in any of our careers in education. Of course, it's been important and challenging for many people in society, but speaking from my own experience as an early childhood educator, I'm looking at the loss of development of students, some of whom have never stepped foot in a classroom. How many of us remember that first day of school, ever, or taking our children to their first days? Instead of that excitement or nervousness, we have a new crop of students whose first days of schools were on a screen in their living rooms, with mom or dad providing some measure of tech support and mediation. We are sure that many of them will adapt and adjust, but some will lose valuable learning experiences and human interaction with trained educators and their peers. We must broaden the array of diagnostic assessments to include school-based student mental health screenings. We need to focus on the social and emotional aspects of teaching and take a break from high-stakes testing. In Florida, we are currently working with an executive order which offers some relief depending on how it's implemented. Our members remain concerned that the student performance portion will impact them negatively, so we're actively working on how that will play out as we negotiate with our district on how those state orders are implemented. Next slide, please. Meeting the needs of our underserved, most vulnerable students, young children, English language learners, and students with special needs must be prioritized and will take tremendous investments in resources and staff. We must also put the needs of those students who are experiencing homelessness, food and economic insecurity, challenges in family relationships, and other forms of distress and trauma at the forefront of what we do moving forward. This has been anything but a normal year, but with sustained focus on meeting the needs of our students disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, we can ensure that they reach their full potential. Next slide. We should create opportunities for increasing the time students spend engaged in guided learning with a qualified professional, especially for our most vulnerable. These opportunities include extending the school day, extending the school year, restructuring the school day, or providing other tutoring and enrichment opportunities. Next slide, please. Professional learning systems should be centered on student success and should also extend beyond pedagogy to take a more holistic approach in recognizing mental and physical well-being and the multiple disparities and injustices exacerbated by this pandemic. This professional development must be available to not only teachers, but to every single employee who plays a role in meeting the needs of every student. Next slide. Equity and excellence. So some effective ways to support teaching and learning are to start with reimagining instruction, curricula, assessments, and professional development grounded in the science of learning. So very important. Slide 12, next slide. We're happy to conclude on the note that the proposed infrastructure bill provides another $100 billion to build new public schools and upgrade existing buildings with better ventilation systems, updated technology labs, and improved school kitchens that can prepare more nutritious meals. Walking through money for states for school, daycare, after school are maintenance of effort requirements. So state, county, and municipal politicians cannot easily misuse the funding or redirect it to other uses. Within the education overall category, there's plenty of flexibility, but the money has to at least flow to the district, and the districts can't be subsequently shortchanged. Here in Florida, that happens quite a bit. I could argue that this would go a long way towards alleviating educational disparity due to poverty and subsequent inequity in access to broadband, technology, wraparound services, and so much more. So I don't want to oversimplify the rating process by giving the Biden-Harris administration an A for listening to educators and putting money into the public system, targeting the most needy, vulnerable populations and continuing to build schools, and for the first time recognizing the intrinsic value of educators. But perhaps his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, who is a community college professor and an EDIE member, has a great influence on what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. If this were a parent-teacher conference, I would emphasize the need to continue to prioritize recovery from the social and emotional problems created for youngsters by this pandemic. Some lost family members, some lost or just could not see their friends and were isolated. Others proved more sensitive to the tension, anxiety, and angst in the environment. We don't know the long-term ramifications that these students may experience, and it will take significant resources to help them to continue to develop. There has been a growing recognition of the essential nature of educators in getting parents back to their jobs so the economy can start to recover. Effective K-12 educators, caring early childhood educators, professional healthcare workers, and elder caregivers are all necessary to allow working families to return in full to the workforce. Likewise, supporting these caregivers is essential, and we will continue to advocate with the administration to legislate and prioritize with these values at the forefront. We will need strong federal recognition of the value of educators and care providers because in places like Florida, anti-union, anti-worker, and frankly, anti-women legislation is in the works. We are currently battling against legislation that would place undue burdens on unions to certify, which would potentially result in loss of professional voice for advocacy for education and our students, but also for our own working conditions, pay, and benefits. So the struggle continues, and we are glad and proud to be an active part of it. Thank you so much for your role in making sure that well-researched policies are recommended and women's voices are heard in public discourse of the common good. Thank you, Connie. Connie, you're muted.
You think you have a grasp on something until we hear from the professionals like you and Shawali and Ariane, and then your head just reels at all of the aspects that have to be covered. I'm going to turn it over to Jeanette, who's going to talk to us quickly about the progress and challenges in the civil rights area.
Actually, I'm going to go over the appointments and one nomination that has yet to be confirmed of Biden during the last 100 days. It is good news. And Mindy reminded us that Jill Biden, the First Lady, will no doubt have a big impact on education. So I wanted to start with adding that. Let me also mention our Vice President is Kamala Harris, a Black and Asian woman. The Treasury Secretary, a big important position, is Janet Yellen. The United States Ambassador to the United Nations is Linda Thomas Greenfield, an African-American woman. The Director of Management and Budget, after a painful near a tendon discussion, and she withdrew, is Shalani Young, an African-American woman. The Secretary of the Department of the Interior is Deb Haaland, a Native American. This is absolutely the first time a Native American has been in charge of the Department of Interior. The Department of Interior is a huge department, and it has a lot of authority over Native American lands as well as Native American education. So having a Native American woman who was a congressperson is important. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is Marcia Fudge, an African-American woman. The Secretary of Energy is Jennifer Granholm, former governor of the former governor of Michigan. And the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, another ginormous department with big influence, is Gina Raimondo. And the Director of National Intelligence in the White House is Errol Haynes. The U.S. Trade Representative is Catherine Tai, an Asian American. And in the Department of Justice, where the Attorney General is Merrick Garland. The number 2 position, the Deputy Attorney General, is Lisa Monaco. The number 3 position in the Department of Justice as the Associate Attorney General is Vanita Gupta. And the 3rd position, yet to be confirmed but nominated, as the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, an organization that I was once a member of, is Kristen Clark, an African-American woman who is nominated but yet to be confirmed. So President Biden has appointed, and confirmed now 12 women, 8 are women of color, and there is one more nomination and also a woman of color. These are cabinet and cabinet level positions. There are numerous other deputies and directors who have been appointed and busy working. During the Trump presidency, only 6 women served at the same time, and excluding 2 women who were actually acting. Trump's biggest appointment, of course, was Amy Coney Barrett, who was a significant nomination to the Supreme Court of the United States. President Biden's nomination exceeds any other president, and the last president that had the most was President Clinton, who had a record of 9 women. So let me close on that positive note. We will look forward to these very able women who are heading non-traditional departments, and we're hoping that we will have a woman's touch in the complicated governance of this country. Connie, back to you.
Thank you, dear. We have some questions in the chat. Ariane, I hope you're still with us. On the issue of occupational segregation, is the solution simply to get women into higher paid men's job, or is it to pay women-dominated occupations more and work toward elimination of the gender differentiation of jobs in general?
You know, I think this is a question to everybody. I think we need both. But I think maybe the second part, particularly in those the jobs that do not need a BA degree, I think maybe we could do more there. It could be higher on the agenda, but it looks to me as if a lot of us, and certainly at the policy level, integrating occupation isn't very high on their agenda. It's more like, okay, yeah, of course, but so I do think that second element could be.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that, on job.
May I add something before we go to another question?
Sorry.
There's something that I read that is that men train for higher paying jobs, doctors, lawyers, accountants, CEOs. Women train for lower paying jobs, women lawyers, women doctors, women CEOs, women accountants. So this gap in pay in these professions is huge and sometimes overlooked.
So as a follow-up to that previous question, Ariane, do we need to restore the Perkin Act set-aside programs or find other ways to incentivize or direct education institutions to integrate their programs better?
Yes, I think the Perkins Act has gone through a number of reiterations, and so I think the biggest successes were when we didn't just have a proper investment in those programs, and then there was a set aside, which a lot of cases basically allowed for maybe one staff position to oversee and work with schools and educational departments. And now for very good, and we had, I think the issue is really enforcement and taking it seriously, because until the last Perkins reorganization, gender equality was at a higher level, higher kind of, it was a proper goal and target for which you could lose funding, right? You had to do a plan, whereas the other bits are reporting requirements. In the last reiteration, they added a lot of reporting requirements, which are important. You monitor and you see what's happening, but the kind of primacy of gender disappeared. And I think in career and technical education, gender differences are so stark that you really need to do more. So, and the other issue is on workforce development, and I don't want to go on too much about this, but workforce development and apprenticeships is that linking, for example, in Oregon, they managed to link highway investment, federal highway funds to deliberate attempts to improve apprentice retention and diversity. And that was used also to work with career and technical educational institutes, to bring in high schools. And what the Tradeswomen's Task Force is suggesting is that the infrastructure bill makes that, it was 0.5% funding mandatory for states to spend on greater diversity efforts. At the moment, it's voluntary and only one state does it.
Right. And now there's a question for all three of you, and of course you know what it is. Will the PowerPoints be available separately also? Is that something we can do, ladies?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I know, Shawala, you're there somewhere. I know, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you had PowerPoints, so there we go. Let's see, the Biden administration cabinet now has 47% women. Well, that's a good thing. If we raise the federal minimum wage to $15, how much of the wage gap would be addressed? Now, that's a good question.
That is a very good question. And I kind of was asked it recently and, said, I don't have the research, because of, $15 also lifts up a lot of men. And of course, it may have a knock-on effect. But I sometimes feel the wage gap is incredibly important, as an organizing tool, as showing how far we're still from equality, including in who takes gaps out of, takes time out. But we also need to look at, the wage gap isn't everything. Basic economic security is not everything, but a lot. And so I feel, it's partly saying I don't know the answer to that question, and I probably should know, but I also think some of it doesn't matter, right? And in the low wage occupation, the wage gap tends to be much lower than in the higher wage one, basically because
everybody's paid poorly.
Poorly.
That's right. Okay. All right. I think that's, does anybody else have a question? Would you like to raise your hand or let us know? Oh, there's Sue Klein.
I'd just like to comment on the previous discussion of sex segregation. I think that's very important, and that that's an area where we might be able to have significant input. And two major ways that come to mind. One is when we revise the Title IX regulations related to sexual harassment, we can also revise the bad Title IX regulations that we've wanted to rescind since they were started in 2006 that confused the prohibitions against sex segregation, which leads to a lot of sex discrimination. So we might be able to rescind the previous bad provisions that were made in the 2006 Title IX regulations, as well as the bad provisions that were made in 2020 on sexual harassment and assault. And another possible big way of helping is by passing the Gender Equity Education Act, which Shawali mentioned, and which would do two things. It would establish an office for gender equity in the U.S. Department of Education. We used to have the Women's Educational Equity Act, which had a little office focusing on gender equity. We used to have sex equity coordinators in career and technical education in the Perkins previous acts, which have been eliminated. So there's much more that we can do on a proactive basis with the Gender Equity Education Act. And it also has a funding provision to help with the training and what I'd like to call the Title IX gender equity infrastructure. Mindy talked about an education infrastructure. What we can envision is a Title IX infrastructure, which would help with the coordination of Title IX coordinators at the state level, at the school district level, at the school level, and colleges and universities and other places, and have them all work together and work with other equity experts focusing on race, bilingual education, and LGBT issues. So we have a lot that we can do, and we might have one of our subsequent meetings focusing on those possibilities. Is there time now for me to give a little bit of information on the next?
Mindy has a question, Sue. Let's let Mindy get her question out.
And really quick, Shawali, I'm not sure if you know what's going on here in Florida, but our Florida legislature, actually in the House, they did pass this. They didn't pass it in the Senate, but they tried to pass a bill that would allow students who are transgender or who are thought to be transgender to be checked to see if they are a girl or a boy to play certain sports. So that's something that we're really fearful here in Florida. It's something that, you know, a lot of organizations stood up against, and it died in the Senate, but it's going to come back and rear its ugly head again. And so this would allow, you know, these students to be checked, to have their body parts checked to see if they are playing in the right gender. So that's something that I just wanted to mention to you, to put that in your head so that you can, you know, see what's going on with that.
Go ahead.
Can I respond? Yeah, and thank you for raising that, Mindy. That's something that we've been tracking at the National Women's Law Center. There have been a number of anti-trans bills that have been introduced in states that are discriminatory and extremely harmful against trans students. We have submitted testimony and have done a sign-on letter for one, at least in South Dakota, but we have been tracking some of the others. And you know, this is something else where we want to see, you know, what the Biden administration will do. At the Trump administration, as some of you know, last year issued a harmful letter, basically saying in an enforcement action in Connecticut that having that the Connecticut State Athletic Association having trans-inclusive athletics policies violated Title IX. But many groups have urged the Biden administration to rescind that letter, which they did. So the letter has been withdrawn, you know, we've asked the administration to take other actions, whether it's supporting litigation, challenging these rules, like litigation brought by the ACLU or other lawsuits. Sorry, not these rules, but these anti-trans laws, by filing amicus briefs or statements of interest, really clearly indicating the federal government's position in support of trans inclusion in sports. As well as other actions I can take. And for the Title IX rule, what I failed to mention is that We are expecting to also see changes with kind of cementing protection for LGBTQ students, making it clear that sex discrimination, in light of Bostick, especially from the Supreme Court's decision last summer, where the court held that sex discrimination under Title VII prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. This administration has made commitments to ensure consistent interpretation with Bostick in the through its enforcement of federal civil rights laws. So I think that's something else we're expecting in that role.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? I want to thank everyone who came today. Sue, you wanted to talk about something for a minute?
I wanted to announce our May 25th CWI meeting. It's going to be focusing on DC for CEDAW. CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, as you know. And the CEDAW group, especially the UN Association for the National Capital Area, is active in getting state education or state councils and large city councils to adopt the CEDAW principles in their own legislation as they do gender analysis. So we're going to be planning to hear from that, and perhaps some updates on other international global gender equity issues from our Vice President, Megan Corrado. So we hope you'll all join us at noon on May 25th. Thanks.
Okay. I want to thank everyone. Whoops, I'm blanking again. Wait a minute. I want to thank everyone who came today and who listened, and especially our speakers. Thank you so much for preparing that material.
Yes.
You have enlightened us tremendously, and we loved it. So we look forward to the future things that are coming, and thank you again.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.